Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to make a video talking to you about some of the books that I have read recently, do a little bit of a catch-up, some book reviews. I've been reading a good mix of some lighthearted, cozy fantasy and sci-fi books and a little bit of romance as well, mixed in with some, I would say, heavier books, modern classics, memoir, things like that. That's what we'll be talking about today. If you're new to the channel, hi, my name is Lillian. I like to talk about books, and if you also like to talk about books, then I would love to have you here and we can talk about books together. Quick side note before we jump into the video, I do apologize if you can still hear a little bit of the cold that I'm still getting over, and also probably a little bit of allergies as it is spring here and allergy season, so still feeling a little bit stuffy. I digress. Let's get on into the books, shall we? The first book that I wanted to chat to you about was a recommendation from my lovely friend Michelle, and that is A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. This was a lovely little novella that I listened to as an audiobook, and I suppose it's more cozy sci-fi than it is fantasy. Anywho, we are following our protagonist, Dex, who has shifted from one career path to another, seemingly trying to find their place and their purpose in their world. And even though their new role as a traveling tea monk is something that they have poured their heart and soul into doing and becoming good at, they begin to notice a growing sense of unease, disillusionment, and a need to explore beyond society's carefully laid paths. There's definitely some loud birdsong going on in the background, so apologies for that. The world where this story takes place is one where humans and robots have gone their separate ways. There was an event in the past where robots that had been previously used for manufacturing human goods and assisting humans in day-to-day life gained consciousness, gained sentience, and it was agreed that both parties would go their separate ways and robots would go and build their own society and not be beholden to a life of servitude to humankind. This was a peaceful decision between the two groups. Humankind also realized that ethically it was not right to keep these machines in their service against their will, and thus have adapted their society in a way where they don't need machines in the same way that they used to. And so as our story starts to unfold, it's been decades, maybe hundreds of years, since humans and robots have seen each other face to face. And lo and behold, just as Dex starts to veer off of the beaten path and into the wild, they come across the first robot that humans have encountered since the separation. This is a very heartwarming story. It's a great palate cleanser if you're in need of something like that. The story itself isn't very high stakes, but it ponders larger questions surrounding purpose, healing from burnout, and what we as humans might need beyond our baseline needs. This was a lovely, sweet little read, and if it sounds like it might be up your alley, I would definitely recommend picking it up. The next two books I'm going to mention I will talk about in tandem, as they are part 1 and part 2 of Duology, and that is Silver in the Wood and Drowned Country by Emily Tesh. These two were also ones that I listened to on audiobook, and I will just make a note that the narrator for both of these books is the same person, and he does an incredible job with the voice acting for the characters, and the tone of his voice is very deep and rich, and I think really lends a wonderful air to this sort of folklore-based tale that leans a little bit on the dark side. Both of these are fantasy novellas, and I'll read you part of the description of the first one. There is a wild man who lives in the deep quiet of Green Hollow, and he listens to the wood. Tobias, tethered to the forest, does not dwell on his past life, but he lives a perfectly unremarkable existence with his cottage, his cat, and his dryads. When Green Hollow Hall acquires a handsome, intensely curious new owner in Henry Silver, everything changes. Old secrets better left buried are dug up, and Tobias is forced to reckon with his troubled past, both the green magic of the woods and the dark things that rest in its heart. As previously mentioned, these stories have a basis in a lot of folklore and fairy tale stories from, I believe, the UK. Both of these were really wonderful reads, very atmospheric. The prose was gorgeous, and I could definitely see these being a treat to read or listen to in the fall. Next is a book that I started to tackle in the last reading vlog that I did. I'll link it up in the cards if you're interested, and that is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. I have finally finished this book. I'm definitely in agreement that this book should be and is considered a modern classic. It is a devastating, haunting book. It is very much a modern Gothic story. I don't want to give too much away about this book, and I try to avoid spoilers when I've talked about it previously, but in essence, we are following a protagonist that is recounting her memories of her growing up in this sort of eccentric, shall we say, boarding school in the countryside of the UK, where she and her fellow classmates are raised together from a very young age. We do not hear mention of their parents. They are watched over by a group of adult guardians who are also their teachers, and they really don't have much interaction with the outside world. Now, as the story goes on, we are clued in here and there more and more to the fact that these children have a sense of otherness about them. They are different than other people in society. They are treated differently, or they will be treated differently when they leave this school setting. They are being raised for a very specific purpose. And I think that's where I will leave the plot description so as not to give any potential spoilers. But what I will say about this book and Ishiguro's writing is that it is devastating and yet tender and emotionally gripping in a way that I have not experienced in quite a long time. What I will say about this book is that it is tender and yet also simultaneously devastating. It is nostalgic, but at the same time there is this element of darkness and unknown that haunts the narration, that haunts the narrator as she sort of slowly circles around these different memories and recounting them, but not quite fully looking on at what this sort of catalyst of, I guess you could say, trauma, of pain, that is slowly, bit by bit, revealed over the course of the book. I think it is fair to consider this book as a tragedy. It is not one that's going to give you warm and fuzzy feelings. It is, as I mentioned, emotionally devastating, but it is beautiful and thought-provoking and haunting. I can definitely see why Ishiguro is a winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, and I definitely look forward to picking up more of his books. The next two books that I will mention are overlapping, related, in the same series, and that is The Queer Principles of Kit Webb and The Perfect Crimes of Marian Hayes, both by Sebastian. These are wonderful, jaunty, queer historical romances set in the Georgian period in the UK. The Queer Principles of Kit Webb is the first one that I started with, and we are following two protagonists, dual perspective. One is Kit Webb, who is a former highwaymen robbing the nobility and wealthy, holding up stagecoaches, and having the wealthy and the nobility part with their extraneous jewels and expensive possessions, taking some of that for himself and his partners, but redistributing that wealth into the community where it's needed. However, Kit has been forced to leave his life of highway robbery in the past due to an injury that he sustained in one of his last jobs that has left him with the need to walk with a cane. His counterpart is Percy, the son of a notorious nobleman in the area who is looking to bring about the downfall of his father and enlist Kit, say that 10 times fast, and enlists Kit's help in parting his father from an object that was once Percy's mother's that is very dear to him and potentially holds a wealth of secrets that could bring down the Duke. As mentioned, this was a lovely, queer, historical romance romp. I definitely appreciated Sebastian's writing in this book as well as the one that I will mention next, but something that I definitely appreciated in both books that I saw was that our happy ending wasn't focused on having the love interests marry into wealth, inherit a title. In fact, quite the opposite. They were very much of the mindset of wanting to divest and part ways with this tradition of, hello ma'am, hi. Wanting to part ways from the tradition and the system of hierarchy, oppression, and amassing large amounts of wealth on the backs of others. That is the European nobility, that is European monarchy. It's done and handled in a lighthearted way, but there are definitely some more, I don't want to say heavy moments, but moments where that is definitely a point of discussion between two characters. Moments of realization from the characters that have been born and raised in nobility. The realization that the system of nobility itself is inherently unfair. It's inherently structured to benefit the few on the backs of the many. Hi, yes ma'am, I agree, I don't like it either. Both of these books were a delight to read, have definitely been in the vein of historical romance that I have been looking for. The Perfect Crimes of Marian Hayes is a second installation in this series. We're following Marian Hayes, who is the former second wife of the Duke from the first story, as well as the childhood friend of Percy. And she is, shall we say, on the run from the events that occurred in the previous book. While on the run from possible imprisonment and hanging, she becomes tangled up in the life of the man who has been blackmailing her and her family for the past year. And they are both forced to, shall we say, go on the run together. As the romance categorization of this book might suggest, romance ensues between the two of them. This was a wonderful continuation from the characters and the themes of the first book. I definitely enjoyed it. In both the first book and in this book, there are definitely, I would say, modern sensibilities that Sebastian does a great job of implementing into the intimate relationships depicted in these books. Modern sensibilities when it comes to things like power dynamics, sexuality, gender roles, and most importantly, consent. I think Sebastian does this in a way that feels very true and integrated into the story. It doesn't feel like I guess I would describe, in some cases I've come across books where these topics or these themes are sort of shoved into the narrative in a way that feels sort of like a copy and paste from Wikipedia, and it feels kind of jarring, and for me at least takes me out of the story. That was not the case in either of these books, and seeing them in these stories definitely made me feel more at ease and able to fully relax into and immerse myself in these stories set in the past. Apologies if you can hear the large machine noise in the background. We have some parkland mowers out and about this morning. Please bear with. The next book that I'll mention I just finished yesterday, and that is Goodbye to Berlin by Christopher Isherwood. This is a book that I don't want to say tolerating, but initially when I first started it, I had the thought of, this is interesting, it's fine, it's not really knocking my socks off. And then as I continued to read, I really started to fall in love with it more and more. Let me backtrack a little bit. Christopher Isherwood is the author of A Single Man that I read 2 years ago now, and absolutely adored. Is one of my favorite books. And since then, I have been kind of chasing that high of reading A Single Man by Christopher Isherwood by reading some of his other books. Earlier this year, I read his book Pride or Violet, which was kind of a dud for me, if I'm honest. My initial experience with the first couple chapters of Goodbye to Berlin weren't necessarily a dud, but didn't necessarily give me the same oomph as I had experienced in A Single Man. What is Goodbye to Berlin? Goodbye to Berlin is a series of, I guess you could call them somewhat autobiographical sketches of Christopher Isherwood's time living in 1930s Berlin during the rise of the Nazis. It is a lot of character sketches and scenes that he witnessed and experienced in his time there. He was there as a writer at the time, and the chapters come together in sort of a loosely formed narrative between a cast of characters and his observances of this time period and of the setting of 1930s Berlin. I think for me it wasn't until maybe I was 3/4 of the way through this book that I really started to fall into it more. There is a character that I don't know, possibly is based off of a real life person, because it is, Goodbye to Berlin is kind of an auto-fiction in a sense, but the character of Bernhard, that the main character, who is also named Christopher Isherwood, encounters several times and has a, shall we say, a tragic end. He's the nephew of a very wealthy Jewish businessman in Berlin, helps him with the operations of his department store. Wow, that is really loud. I am so sorry. And yeah, he's just a very interesting, nuanced character, and I think in reading the descriptions of him, reading the interactions that play out between him and Christopher Isherwood were just very nuanced, very layered, and made me want more of that dynamic between the two of them. Once I reached that section of the book, I definitely started to form a greater appreciation for what Isherwood, I think, was trying to do. There is, in part of the introduction to this book, Isherwood describes, the fact that he was writing these sketches during his time there, but that they were never really fully finished because he ended up having to flee Berlin once things got bad enough, and he ended up publishing this book sort of in a, I don't want to say unfinished, but it feels open-ended, and like the stories themselves are kind of these large brushstrokes that he's painting, depicting his time there, depicting the people he met and the things that he witnessed. I think the context of why they are not fully finished lends itself to, yes, a framework to view these stories within that gives them, I think, some structure and some context, and allows the reader to fill in some gaps here and there as to why, especially towards the end, they become much more fragmented, and scenes depicting the larger population's reaction to the intensifying Nazi presence, influence. And the final scene is one where Christopher Isherwood, the main character, is sort of left in this state of sort of panicked leaving of Berlin, but also a state of disbelief that things have gotten to the point where they did, and it drops off from there, and you're left to sort of fill in the blanks. But yeah, I would say overall I definitely enjoyed this book. It definitely has me thinking. It's given me a lot to chew on. I ended up going back and annotating a lot of the scenes that resonated with me, that I found interesting. Isherwood is really good at doing character studies, I've found, and he's a very keen eye for observation, human nature, and depicting sort of the personal quirks of different people. So yeah, that was goodbye to Berlin. My battery's flashing at me, so I'm definitely try to make sure I get through the rest of the books. The next book that I'll mention is Budapest Diary in Search of the Motherbook by Susan Rubin Suleiman. This is one I mentioned in my Hungarian book haul, as well as one that I took with me on my recent trip to Budapest. This is a really interesting, fascinating memoir that Suleiman wrote. She was initially born and raised in the city of Budapest, but fled with her family at the age of 10 in 1949 when the communist regime started to take a tighter grasp on the city and the country. Anti-Semitism was on the rise, so she and her family ended up fleeing to other parts of Europe and eventually to the United States, where she would grow up, end up becoming a professor at Harvard for French literature and history, not go back to the city of Budapest until she was in her 40s with her mother, who was dying of likely terminal cancer, and getting to revisit her memories there. There's a section of the book that is a memoir recollection of the memories that she has from childhood growing up in Budapest, her experience fleeing with her family, the initial trip that she took back with her mother, but the diary part is actually a published diary of her time that she went back to Budapest in the 1990s, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, to take a sabbatical teaching position there for 6 months. And so getting to go back and actually live in the city that she was born in, go through and try and track down elements of her family's history. It is a really fascinating memoir, really interesting to see the city in the light of the 1990s, sort of right after, called the change from the Soviet Union to a capitalist economic and political society. And she definitely makes note of conversations that she has with her fellow Hungarians about sort of their feeling about the change, their experiences under the communist regime during the World Wars. Really fascinating. It was one that I was really glad to have with me on my trip. It definitely added a wonderful layer of depth and information to the places that I was visiting and revisiting in a lot of cases, having lived there myself for 4 months in 2016. The next book that I want to talk about is a cozy fantasy darling, and that is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. I listened to this one on audiobook as well. This was definitely a treat. It is a cozy fantasy novella story. It's the story of an orc who has worked to give up her life as a mercenary in favor of settling down and opening up a coffee shop in a town that has never experienced coffee before. And it is the gentle unfolding of her story, of the relationships that she builds with the people that she meets, the adventures and the ups and downs of her experience as she works towards building and achieving this dream that she's had for years. This was a lovely little read. Would definitely recommend it if you're in the market for a cozy fantasy novella. This was definitely a nice little palate cleanser after having finished Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. And the final book that I wanted to mention to you today is Inseparable by Simone de Beauvoir. This is a recent publication by Simone de Beauvoir's estate. It is a novel that Simone de Beauvoir wrote I believe in the 50s, but was not published until recently, posthumously. It was deemed to be too intimate of a novel to publish during her lifetime. And would you believe it? My camera died, so I'm back the next day to finish up this review. Inseparable is a fictionalized depiction, a very influential friendship that Simone de Beauvoir had in her childhood between herself and her childhood friend Zaza. The names have been changed in this book. Beauvoir is the character of Sylvie and Zaza is the character of Andre. Apologies. It's a short but potent story. We witness the initial meeting of these two friends, their developing first steps of their friendship, follow them from their early years up through young adulthood. Throughout, the character of Sylvie is definitely deeply inspired by and driven by this need to, I guess, impress and also be like her friend Andre. It's not explicitly said in the book itself, but for me there was definitely some queer undertones going on there as far as the level of infatuation that Sylvie has with Andre, but it's definitely not requited in the sense of the character of Sylvie expresses that she doesn't feel like Andre cares about her in the same way or the same level that Sylvie cares about her. So we're following these two and their friendship, these sort of parallel childhoods in these two different households. Sylvie's childhood, while still strict and regimented by her parents, is quite lenient in comparison with Andre's upbringing with her French Catholic family. Andre is sort of held to this incredible pinnacle of a standard and is, for many years especially, even more so as she gets older and comes into a bit more, shall we say, adult responsibility as far as her family's expectations of her helping out around the household, helping take care of her siblings. Once Sylvie and Andre both reach young adulthood, there is this enormous amount of pressure that Sylvie observes being put on Andre as far as what's expected of her, the commitment of her time, having literally no time to herself, to the point where she, not to spoil anything, but intentionally injures herself in order to get some free time and be off her feet. Sylvie has also introduced Andre to a male friend of hers, and they have sort of developed this very chaste romance, shall we say. Andre is very much unsure of whether this young man returns her affections in the same level, in the same way that she does, and is ready to move into sort of engagement and starting a life together. The young man also comes from a French Catholic family and is sort of under, I guess I would consider them limitations or mechanisms of control of his own making, of his sort of view of how things should be done, view of how he wants his life and his timeline to look like, as holding to a very rigid standard. Definitely a theme throughout the book is Andre grappling with and coming up again and again her inability to control her own life, her inability to make her own decisions in the context of her family, in the context of her own life. And that's something that eats away at her. It's something that I guess you could say destroys her in the end. You see Sylvie's character witnessing the downfall and the destruction, in a way, of her friend bit by bit, with the amount of pressure and expectations that are put on her, the lack of control that she has, the lack of choice that she has in all aspects of her life, essentially. I think Andre, in a way, saw this potential engagement and marriage as a way to be free in more of a way than she is as an unmarried young woman in her parents' household. Her longing to be able to have self-agency and make choices for herself and have freedom of movement and freedom of choosing what she would like to do with her time. I don't want to spoil the ending, but I will say that it does not necessarily end happily. There is this breaking point, shall we say, that the character of Andre reaches. There are definitely metaphors woven throughout this story that touch on Beauvoir's critique of what she saw as the hypocrisy of French society and French religious culture, shall we say, in her growing up, seeing how the limitations and restrictions that were put on young women in effect sort of killed any potential that they might have had. And yeah, it was definitely an interesting read. It was a tragic read, and it was, I feel like, an interesting, thought-provoking introduction to Beauvoir's work in general. I feel like it definitely gives you insight into some of her own worldview and viewpoint, as it does depict aspects of her own growing up and a relationship that definitely shaped who she was as a person. And I think in some ways you could definitely argue her academic drive to achieve what she ended up achieving. But yeah, folks, those are the books that I have been reading recently. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know if you've read any of them in the comments, or just tell me what you've been reading as well. I'd love to hear it. If you're interested in finding me other places, I will leave a link to my Substack and my Instagram in the doobly-doo below. But I hope you are having a lovely day, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.